The morning sun poured through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the penthouse, casting long shadows across the polished marble floors. Alexander Chen stood by the window, coffee in hand, gazing down at the city below. From up here, the people looked like ants, scurrying about their meaningless little lives. He smiled at the thought. Today was Tuesday, which meant his cleaning service would be sending someone over, and he had better things to do than worry about such trivial matters. At 35 years old, Alexander had everything a man could want. His name was printed on concert posters across 3 continents. Critics called him a genius. His recordings had won awards that most pianists could only dream about. The black Steinway grand piano in his living room had cost more than most people earned in 5 years, and it was just one of 3 pianos in his apartment. Yes, life was good when you were born with talent and knew how to use it. The doorbell rang at exactly 9 o'clock. Alexander didn't move from his spot by the window. His housekeeper had a key. They could let themselves in. That's what he paid them for, wasn't it? He heard the door open and close, followed by the soft sound of footsteps in the hallway. "Hello, Mr. Chen?" A woman's voice called out, hesitant and polite. Alexander turned, slightly annoyed at being addressed directly. The woman standing in his living room was not the usual girl who cleaned his apartment. This one was older, maybe in her late 50s, with graying hair pulled back in a simple bun. She wore the standard uniform of the cleaning company, and her hands clutched a caddy filled with cleaning supplies. Her eyes were kind but tired, the kind of tired that comes from years of hard work, not just a few sleepless nights. "You're not Rachel," Alexander said flatly, not bothering with pleasantries. "No, sir. I'm Maria. Rachel called in sick today, so the company sent me instead. I hope that's all right." She spoke with a slight accent, her words careful and measured. Alexander waved his hand dismissively. "Fine, whatever. Just do what you need to do and try not to make too much noise. I have a performance coming up and I need to practice." Maria nodded and began her work, starting with the far corner of the living room. Alexander returned his attention to his coffee, scrolling through his phone to check the morning's emails. His agent had sent him 3 messages about interview requests. A magazine wanted to do a feature article. A morning show wanted him as a guest. Everyone always wanted a piece of Alexander Chen. He set his coffee cup down on the counter and walked toward the piano. This was his sanctuary, his throne. When he sat on that bench, he was no longer just a man. He became something greater, something transcendent. His fingers touched the keys and he began to play through scales, warming up his muscles and his mind. Maria worked quietly, dusting the shelves that lined the walls. Alexander had collections of things he'd gathered from his travels. Expensive trinkets that meant nothing to him but looked impressive when guests visited. She moved carefully around each item, her movements efficient and practiced. As Alexander transitioned from scales into actual music, he noticed Maria's movements slow. She was still working, still dusting, but something had changed in her rhythm. He was playing Rachmaninoff, one of the composer's most technically demanding pieces, and he knew he was playing it brilliantly. His fingers flew across the keys, hitting every note with precision. This was the piece he would perform at Carnegie Hall next month, and he wanted it to be perfect. When he finished the section he was working on, he paused to make a note on his sheet music. That's when he noticed Maria had stopped moving altogether. She stood near his piano, a cloth in her hand, staring at the instrument with an expression he couldn't quite read. Was it longing, sadness? He couldn't tell, and frankly, he didn't care. "Is there a problem?" he asked, his tone sharp. Maria jumped slightly as if she'd forgotten where she was. "Oh, no, sir. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to disturb you. It's just, that's a beautiful instrument." Alexander looked at his piano, then back at her. "Yes, well, it should be. It cost enough." He ran his hand along the smooth black surface. "This is a Steinway Model D concert grand. Only the best for serious musicians. I suppose most people wouldn't understand the difference between something like this and a cheap upright piano from a department store." There was that flicker in Maria's eyes again. Something that came and went so quickly Alexander almost missed it. She simply nodded and said, "I'm sure you're right, sir," before returning to her dusting. But Alexander wasn't done. Maybe it was the stress of his upcoming performance, or maybe it was just his nature. But something made him want to continue. "Do you know anything about classical music?" he asked, not really expecting an answer. Maria paused in her work. "A little bit, sir. A little bit, Alexander repeated with a slight laugh. Let me guess. You probably think you like classical music because you've heard Beethoven's Fifth Symphony in a movie or something. He began to play a few bars of the famous opening. Dum 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 dum, everyone knows that one, right? Yes, sir, Maria said quietly, continuing her work around the room. Alexander wasn't satisfied with her simple response. He wanted to make his point, to remind himself of his own importance by highlighting the gap between them. You see, there's a difference between hearing music and understanding it. Real classical music, the kind I perform, requires years of training, dedication, and natural talent. It's not something just anyone can do. Most people, they hear the notes, but they don't feel the music. They don't understand what the composer was trying to say. Maria had moved to dust the area near the piano now, carefully cleaning around the photographs Alexander had displayed. Pictures of himself with famous conductors, with other renowned musicians, with important people at important events. She looked at each one as she cleaned, her expression neutral. Have you ever played piano? Alexander asked suddenly, the question coming out more like a challenge than genuine curiosity. Maria's hand stilled on one of the picture frames. For a moment she didn't answer. Then very quietly she said, yes, sir, a long time ago. Alexander actually laughed at that. The sound echoed in the large room, bouncing off the high ceilings. Really, let me guess. You took lessons when you were a child? Learned Mary Had a Little Lamb and Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star? Something like that, Maria replied, her voice so soft he almost didn't hear her. Well, Alexander said, standing up from the piano bench with exaggerated ceremony. Since you're so experienced, perhaps you'd like to give it a try? He gestured toward the piano with a mocking bow. Please be my guest. Show me what a cleaning lady knows about playing piano. I'm sure it will be enlightening. He expected her to refuse, to laugh nervously and decline his cruel offer. That's what any reasonable person would do when faced with such obvious mockery. But something happened that Alexander didn't expect. Maria stopped cleaning. She set down her supplies carefully on a nearby table. Her hands, rough and worn from years of hard work, trembled slightly as she dried them on her uniform. Then she looked at Alexander, really looked at him, and in that moment something shifted in the air of the room. All right, she said simply. If you insist. Alexander's smile widened. This was going to be entertaining. He stepped aside, giving her full access to his precious piano, confident that in a few moments she would embarrass herself, apologize, and return to her cleaning. Then everything would go back to normal, and he could continue his practice. Maria walked toward the piano with slow, measured steps. But as she got closer to the instrument, something strange happened. Her posture changed. Her shoulders straightened. The tired, humble cleaning lady seemed to transform before his eyes. When she sat down on the bench, adjusting her position with the practiced ease of someone who had done this thousands of times before, Alexander felt the first tiny whisper of doubt creep into his mind. Her fingers hovered over the keys for just a moment. She closed her eyes and took a deep breath. And then she began to play. The first notes that came from the piano were soft, almost hesitant. Alexander stood behind Maria, his arms crossed, that smug smile still playing on his lips. He was already preparing his condescending response in his mind. Something that would sound encouraging but would really just highlight how far she was from real musicianship. But then something changed. Maria's fingers found their confidence, and suddenly the room filled with music that made Alexander's breath catch in his throat. She was playing Chopin. Not just any Chopin, but the Ballad No. 1 in G minor. Alexander knew this piece intimately. He had performed it himself dozens of times. It was a monster of a composition, full of technical challenges that could trip up even experienced concert pianists. The piece required not just skill but emotion, interpretation, and a deep understanding of what Chopin was trying to express. And Maria was playing it perfectly. No, not just perfectly. She was playing it beautifully. Alexander's smile faded. He took a step closer to the piano, watching her hands move across the keys. Her fingers, those work-worn, calloused fingers that he had dismissed so easily, were dancing through passages that took most pianists years to master. The opening melody flowed like water, gentle and melancholic, exactly as Chopin had intended. But it wasn't just the technical accuracy that shocked Alexander. It was the feeling behind it. When he played this piece, he focused on hitting every note correctly, on maintaining the proper tempo, on impressing the audience with his skill. But Maria was doing something different. She was telling a story. Every phrase had meaning. Every pause spoke volumes. The music wasn't just coming from her fingers. It was coming from somewhere deeper, somewhere that Alexander had forgotten existed. The piece built in intensity, moving into the more aggressive middle section. Maria's hands flew across the keys, her body swaying slightly with the rhythm. There was a passage here, a particularly difficult run of notes that Alexander always struggled with, a part where his fingers sometimes stumbled no matter how much he practiced. Maria played through it without a single hesitation, making it sound effortless and natural, as if the piano was simply an extension of her own voice. Alexander felt his legs go weak. He reached for the back of a nearby chair to steady himself. This couldn't be happening. This woman, this cleaning lady who had shown up at his door an hour ago, was playing one of the most challenging pieces in the classical repertoire as if she had written it herself. And she was playing it better than he could. Better than he ever could. The music shifted again, returning to the gentler theme from the opening but now colored by everything that had come before. There was a sadness in the way Maria played these notes, a weight of experience and loss that made the melody almost unbearable in its beauty. Alexander felt something wet on his cheek and realized with shock that a tear had escaped from his eye. When was the last time music had made him cry? When was the last time he had felt anything while playing, other than satisfaction at his own technical prowess? The final section approached, the dramatic conclusion that always brought audiences to their feet. Maria's playing intensified, her whole body engaged in the performance now. The notes thundered through the apartment, powerful and overwhelming. Alexander could see the muscles in her forearms tensing with the effort, could see the concentration on her face. But there was also something that looked like joy there. Pure, unbridled joy. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, it was over. The final chord rang out through the apartment, hanging in the air like a question waiting for an answer. Maria's hands remained on the keys for a moment, then slowly lifted. She sat very still, her eyes closed, her breathing heavy. The silence that followed was deafening. Alexander stood frozen, unable to speak, unable to move, unable to process what he had just witnessed. His mind raced, trying to make sense of it all. Who was this woman? Where had she learned to play like that? Why was she cleaning houses instead of performing on the world's greatest stages? Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he found his voice. It came out as barely more than a whisper. "Who are you?" Maria opened her eyes slowly. She looked down at her hands, still resting on the edge of the keyboard, and Alexander could see they were shaking. When she turned to look at him, her eyes were glistening with unshed tears. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice breaking slightly. "I shouldn't have. I didn't mean to." "No," Alexander interrupted, his voice stronger now but stripped of all its earlier arrogance. "Don't apologize. I've never—" He struggled to find the right words. "In all my years of performing and all the concerts I've attended, I've never heard that piece played with such—" He trailed off because he didn't know how to finish the sentence.
Such feeling.
Such understanding, such soul. All of those words seemed inadequate to describe what he had just experienced. Maria stood up from the piano bench, smoothing down her uniform with those trembling hands. "It's been a very long time," she said quietly. "I wasn't sure I could still play. I haven't touched a piano in over 20 years. 20 years? Alexander repeated, incredulous. "That's impossible. Nobody plays like that without constant practice. Nobody just— How is that even possible?" Maria walked away from the piano, moving toward the windows where Alexander had stood earlier that morning. She looked out at the city below, and when she spoke, her voice was distant, as if she was talking to herself as much as to him. "Some things you never forget," she said, "no matter how hard you try." Alexander's mind was spinning with questions. He moved closer to her, seeing her now as a person for the first time that day, not just as hired help. The morning light caught the gray in her hair, the lines around her eyes that spoke of years of hardship and struggle. But there was something else there too, something he had missed before. Dignity, strength, and a profound sadness that seemed to seep from her very core. "Where did you learn to play like that?" he asked. Maria was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice was so soft he had to strain to hear her. Juilliard, she said. A lifetime ago. Alexander felt the room tilt. Juilliard, the most prestigious music school in the country, perhaps in the world. The place where legends were born. He had studied there himself, had walked those hallowed halls thinking he was special, thinking he was chosen, and this woman had been there too. You went to Juilliard, he repeated, still trying to wrap his mind around this revelation. You were a pianist, a real pianist. So what? He gestured helplessly at her uniform, at the cleaning supplies she had left on the table. What happened? Maria turned to face him, and in her eyes Alexander saw decades of pain and sacrifice and choices that couldn't be undone. Life happened, she said simply. Life always happens, doesn't it? She moved to pick up her cleaning supplies, clearly ready to return to work, to pretend that the last 10 minutes hadn't occurred. But Alexander couldn't let it go. He stepped in front of her, blocking her path. Please, he said, and the word felt foreign in his mouth because he couldn't remember the last time he had genuinely pleaded with anyone. Please tell me. I need to know. How does someone who plays like that end up? He couldn't finish the sentence. Couldn't say the words that might sound like another insult. Maria looked at him for a long moment, studying his face as if trying to decide whether he was worthy of her story. Finally, she sighed and set down her cleaning caddy once more. 25 years ago, she began, I was a different person. I had a different name, a different life. I was Maria Elena Rodriguez Vasquez, and I was going to be a star. Alexander listened, hardly daring to breathe, as Maria began to tell him the story of the life she had lost. Maria walked back to the window, her eyes distant as she began to speak. Alexander remained silent, afraid that any interruption might break the spell and she would stop talking. He found himself genuinely wanting to know, needing to understand how someone with such extraordinary talent could have disappeared from the world he knew so well. I grew up in a small apartment in Washington Heights, Maria began, her voice steady but tinged with the weight of memory. My father worked in a factory. My mother cleaned offices at night. We didn't have much, but my mother, she had this old upright piano that her grandmother had given her. It was terribly out of tune, missing a few keys, but to me it was the most beautiful thing in the world. She smiled slightly at the memory. I was 5 years old when I first sat down at that piano. My mother said I taught myself to play before I could properly read words. By the time I was 7, my elementary school music teacher told my parents I had a gift. She said I needed proper training, real lessons, but we couldn't afford them. My father was working overtime just to keep food on the table. Alexander listened, feeling a strange discomfort growing in his chest. He had started piano lessons at age 4 with a private instructor who came to his family's home 3 times a week. He'd never had to wonder if his parents could afford it. The privilege of his own upbringing was suddenly glaring and uncomfortable. But my teacher, Mrs. Chen, she didn't give up on me, Maria continued. She started giving me free lessons after school, an hour every day. She saw something in me, believed in me when nobody else could afford to. By the time I was 12, I was winning every competition I entered. By 15, I was performing with youth orchestras, and then when I was 17, I got the letter. Her voice caught slightly on those last words, and Alexander saw her grip the windowsill a little tighter. Juilliard offered me a full scholarship, a full ride. Do you know what that meant to a girl like me? To my family? It was like winning the lottery. It was every dream I'd ever had coming true all at once. My mother cried for 3 days straight. My father, he took me out to dinner at a real restaurant for the first time in my life to celebrate. Alexander could picture it so clearly, the joy, the hope, the sense that anything was possible. He had felt something similar when he was accepted to Juilliard, but for him it had been expected, almost inevitable. For Maria, it must have been miraculous. Those years at Juilliard were the best of my life, Maria said, and now there was a warmth in her voice that hadn't been there before. I practiced 8, sometimes 10 hours a day. I lived and breathed music. My teachers said I had something special, that I could really make it. By my senior year, I had an agent interested in representing me. There was talk of a debut at Lincoln Center. Critics were starting to notice me. Everything was falling into place. She paused, and Alexander could sense the shift in the story coming, the moment where everything changed. He braced himself for it. In my final semester, I met Roberto. He was working construction on a building near campus. I saw him on my way to class every day, and one morning he smiled at me. That was all it took. One smile and I was lost. Maria's voice softened with affection even as sadness crept in. He wasn't part of the music world. He didn't know Chopin from Beethoven, couldn't tell you what a sonata was. But he was kind and he was real, and when I was with him, I felt like I could be something other than just a pianist. I could be a person. Alexander understood that feeling more than he wanted to admit. His entire identity was wrapped up in being a pianist, in being Alexander Chen the virtuoso. Who was he without the music? He had never allowed himself to find out. We got married 2 months after I graduated, Maria continued. Everyone told me I was making a mistake, that I was throwing away my career. My teachers were disappointed. My agent dropped me, said I wasn't serious enough about my future, but I thought I could have both. I thought I could build a life with Roberto and still be a musician. I was young and stupid and in love. She turned away from the window now, facing Alexander but not really seeing him. Her eyes were looking at something far away, something only she could see. For the first year, it worked. I taught piano lessons during the day, practiced in the evenings, and still did some small performances. Roberto supported my dreams. He would come to every recital, sitting in the front row even though he didn't understand the music. He was my biggest fan, and then I got pregnant with our first child. A genuine smile crossed Maria's face at this. My daughter Sophia, she was perfect. When she was born, I thought my heart would explode from happiness. But being a mother, a real mother, it takes time, it takes energy, and making a career in classical music, that takes everything. I started practicing less, performing less. The opportunities that had been coming my way started going to other people. Younger people. People who could dedicate themselves completely. Alexander felt a knot forming in his stomach. He had never had to make such choices. His career had always come first, always would come first. He'd never had to consider splitting his focus, dividing his time between music and something equally important. Then Roberto got hurt, Maria said, and her voice dropped even lower. He fell from scaffolding at a construction site. 3 stories. He survived, thank God, but his back was never the same. He couldn't work anymore, not the heavy labor he'd been doing. The medical bills were enormous. Insurance covered some of it, but not enough. Never enough. She moved away from the window, walking slowly around the room as she spoke, as if the movement helped her tell the story. I had 2 children by then. Sophia was 3 and my son Miguel was 1 year old. Roberto was in constant pain and couldn't provide for us anymore. Someone had to step up. Someone had to make sure there was food on the table and a roof over our heads, so I did what I had to do. You gave up music, Alexander said quietly, finally understanding. Maria nodded. I gave up everything. I sold my piano to pay for Roberto's medication. I took a job cleaning offices at night, because it paid better than teaching piano lessons and I could work while the children slept. During the day, I took care of Roberto and the kids. There was no time for practice, no time for performances, no time for dreams. But couldn't you have... Alexander started, then stopped himself. What could she have done? What choice had she really had? He, who had never had to sacrifice anything, who had every opportunity handed to him, what right did he have to question her decisions? People always ask that, Maria said, as if reading his mind. Couldn't you have found a way? Couldn't you have made it work? And the answer is no. Not really. When you're choosing between paying for your husband's physical therapy or maintaining your concert career, when you're deciding between feeding your children or buying sheet music, the choice isn't really a choice at all. You do what you have to do to keep your family alive. She looked at Alexander now, really looked at him, and he saw in her eyes a strength he had never possessed. I didn't regret it, she said firmly. Not for one day. My children got to grow up with food in their bellies and a mother who was there for them. Roberto got the care he needed. We survived. That's more than a lot of families can say. But did I miss the music? Every single day, every moment. It was like losing a limb. Something that had been part of me for so long that I didn't know how to exist without it. Alexander felt his throat tighten. How did you bear it? Maria smiled sadly. You learn to live with loss. It becomes part of you, like a scar that never fully heals but eventually stops hurting quite so much. I told myself that music was a luxury I couldn't afford anymore. That it belonged to a different version of me, a girl who didn't exist anymore. But you never forgot how to play, Alexander said, gesturing toward the piano. No, Maria agreed. I never forgot. Sometimes at night after everyone was asleep, I would sit at the table and move my fingers like I was playing, practicing pieces in my mind. It was all I had left. The room fell silent. Alexander didn't know what to say. Every word that came to mind seemed inadequate, meaningless in the face of such sacrifice. Alexander sat down heavily on his expensive leather couch, his mind reeling from everything Maria had told him. He looked at his hands, the same hands that had been praised and photographed, that had been featured in magazine articles about his technique. These hands had never worked a day of manual labor. They had never scrubbed floors or cleaned toilets or done anything more demanding than playing piano. He felt a wave of shame wash over him so powerful it almost made him sick. Where are your children now? He asked finally, needing to know the rest of the story. Maria's face brightened slightly. Sophia is a nurse at Mount Sinai Hospital. Miguel is a teacher at a middle school in the Bronx. My youngest, Elena, she's finishing her degree in social work. They're all good people, all working to help others. I'm very proud of them. And your husband? Roberto passed away 5 years ago, Maria said softly. His health never fully recovered from the accident. But he got to see all 3 of our children graduate from college. He got to walk Sophia down the aisle at her wedding. He lived long enough to meet his first grandchild. That's more than we dared hope for in those early days after his fall. Alexander felt something crack inside his chest. This woman had lost everything, had sacrificed her entire future, had given up her dreams, and yet she spoke about her life with gratitude instead of bitterness. How? How was that possible? Maria, he said, and his voice came out rougher than he intended. What you did today, playing that piece, that wasn't just muscle memory. That was artistry. That was genius. You can't tell me that after 25 years away from music, you just sat down and played like that. Maria smiled sadly and shook her head. You're wrong. It was exactly muscle memory. And maybe something more. Maybe it was all those nights practicing in my mind. All those years of carrying that music inside me with nowhere for it to go. When I touched those keys today, it all came pouring out. 25 years of silence, 25 years of longing, all in one performance. Alexander stood up and began pacing, his mind working frantically. An idea was forming, something that seemed crazy but also felt absolutely necessary. He turned to face Maria. When was the last time you performed for an audience? He asked. Maria thought for a moment. My last real performance was a recital at Juilliard just before graduation. So 26 years ago, why? Alexander's heart was pounding now. He pulled out his phone and started scrolling through his calendar. I have a concert at Carnegie Hall in 3 weeks. It's a big deal, one of the most important performances of my career. Critics will be there, recording executives, everyone who matters in classical music. Maria nodded politely, not understanding where he was going with this. That's wonderful. I'm sure you'll be magnificent. I want you to perform with me, Alexander said. The words hung in the air between them. Maria stared at him as if he'd suddenly started speaking a foreign language. What? She said finally. I want you to perform with me at Carnegie Hall. We'll play a duet, something for 4 hands, or you can have a solo piece. Or both, I don't care. But the world needs to hear you play. Maria laughed, but it was a nervous, disbelieving sound. Mr. Chen, I appreciate the sentiment, but that's impossible. I'm a cleaning lady. I haven't performed in over 2 decades. I don't have the repertoire prepared. I don't have anything to wear. I don't care about any of that, Alexander interrupted, his voice intense. None of that matters. What matters is that you have more musicality in your little finger than I have in my entire body. What matters is that when you played today, I felt something I haven't felt in years. You reminded me why I fell in love with music in the first place before it became about fame and reviews and ticket sales. Maria was shaking her head, backing away slightly. You're not thinking clearly. This is crazy. I can't just walk onto the stage at Carnegie Hall. Do you know how ridiculous that sounds? Why not? Alexander challenged. Give me one good reason why not. Because I'm nobody, Maria said, her voice rising with emotion. Because I'm 57 years old and I clean houses for a living. Because I don't belong in that world anymore. Because I gave up that right a long time ago when I chose my family over my career. You gave up nothing, Alexander said fiercely. You made a choice, the only choice you could make, the right choice. But that doesn't mean your story has to end here. That doesn't mean you can't reclaim something of what you lost. Maria's eyes filled with tears. You don't understand. It's been too long. I'm too old, too rusty, too far removed from that life. I wouldn't even know where to begin. Alexander moved closer to her, his earlier arrogance completely gone, replaced by an earnestness he rarely allowed himself to feel. Then let me help you. We have 3 weeks. We can practice together every day. I can arrange everything, the performance slot, the publicity, everything. You just have to say yes. But why? Maria asked, wiping at her eyes. Why would you do this? You don't even know me. This morning you looked at me like I was invisible, like I was just another piece of furniture in your apartment. Now you want to share a stage with me at Carnegie Hall? It doesn't make sense. Alexander was quiet for a moment, considering his answer carefully. This morning I was an arrogant fool who thought talent and success were the same thing. I thought because I'd achieved fame, because my name was on posters and my face was in magazines, that I was special, that I was better than other people, better than you. He gestured toward the piano. But then you played, and in those few minutes you showed me something I'd forgotten. You showed me what music is supposed to be. It's not about perfect technique or impressive credentials. It's about truth. It's about pouring your heart out through your fingers and hoping that someone, somewhere will understand what you're trying to say. Maria was crying openly now, not bothering to hide her tears. I've played that Chopin ballade 100 times, Alexander continued. I've performed it in concert halls across the world, but I've never played it the way you did today. I've never felt it the way you felt it, because I've never sacrificed anything real. I've never lost anything that mattered. My music is technically perfect, but it's empty. Yours is alive. He took a deep breath. So I'm not doing this for you. I'm doing it for me. I'm doing it because sharing a stage with you might teach me how to be a real musician again instead of just a trained performer. And I'm doing it because, what happened to you? The fact that you disappeared from music when you had so much to offer, that's wrong. It's unjust. And maybe I can't fix the past 25 years, but I can give you this moment. I can give you one more chance to be seen, to be heard, to be Maria Elena Rodriguez Vasquez again. The apartment was silent, except for the sound of the city filtering up from below. Maria stood very still, tears streaming down her face, her chest rising and falling with heavy breaths. Alexander waited, hardly daring to breathe, knowing that his entire life had somehow led to this moment, to this choice he was offering this woman. Finally, Maria spoke, her voice barely a whisper. I'm scared, she said. I know, Alexander replied gently. But you've been scared before and you survived it. You're one of the strongest people I've ever met. If you could sacrifice your dreams for your family, surely you can find the courage to take them back just for one night. Maria looked past Alexander to the piano, that beautiful instrument that had witnessed her revelation. She thought about all those years of silence, all those nights of finger exercises performed on kitchen tables, all those moments when she had heard music in her head but had no way to let it out. She thought about her children, grown now and making their own lives. She thought about Roberto, who had always told her she should play again someday, who had believed in her even when she couldn't believe in herself. And then she thought about that girl from Washington Heights, the one with the impossible dream and the determination to make it real. That girl was still inside her somewhere, wasn't she? Maybe buried deep, maybe scarred and weathered by time and hardship, but still there, still alive, still hoping. Maria took a deep breath and looked at Alexander. In his eyes, she saw something she hadn't expected. She saw respect. She saw admiration. And most importantly, she saw belief. Okay, she said, her voice stronger now. Okay, I'll do it. The next 3 weeks passed in a blur of music and emotion. Every morning, Maria arrived at Alexander's apartment, but this time she wasn't carrying cleaning supplies. She carried sheet music, a notebook, and a heart full of hope mixed with terror. Alexander had cleared his schedule, turning down interviews and canceling other commitments. For the first time in his career, something mattered more than his own advancement. They practiced for hours each day. At first, Maria's fingers were stiff, her timing uncertain. 25 years away from serious practice had taken their toll, but Alexander was patient in a way he had never been before. When she struggled with a passage, he didn't criticize. He simply played it with her, over and over until her muscle memory returned. "You're being too gentle with yourself," he told her one afternoon during their second week of practice. "You're holding back. I can hear it. You're afraid to make mistakes, afraid to really let go." Maria stopped playing and looked at her hands. "What if I'm not as good as you think I am? What if that day I played for you was just a fluke, adrenaline and emotion, and I can't do it again?" Alexander sat down beside her on the piano bench, something he would never have done with another musician. The piano bench was sacred space, but somehow with Maria it felt right to share it. "That day wasn't a fluke," he said firmly. "That was you, the real you, the you that's been hiding for 25 years. Stop trying to be perfect and just be honest. That's all music really is. Honesty with notes." His words struck something deep inside her. Honesty with notes. She had spent so many years being practical, being responsible, being what everyone needed her to be. When was the last time she had been honest about anything, let alone through music? She placed her hands back on the keys and began to play again. This time she didn't hold back. She let herself feel the music, let herself remember the joy and the pain, let herself be that young girl from Washington Heights who believed anything was possible. The notes flowed from her fingers with a freedom she hadn't felt in decades. When she finished, Alexander was smiling. "There you are," he said softly. "That's who I want the world to see." As the concert date approached, word began to spread. Alexander had insisted on telling Maria's story to the press. At first, she had been reluctant, embarrassed by the idea of her struggles being made public, but Alexander convinced her that her story mattered, that people needed to hear it. How many talented people are out there right now, working jobs they never dreamed of, their gifts buried under the weight of survival? He asked her. How many? Kids growing up in places like Washington Heights believe that music is only for rich people, for people like me who never had to choose between their dreams and their family's next meal. Your story shows them that talent doesn't come from privilege. It comes from the heart. The night of the performance arrived faster than Maria could believe. She stood backstage at Carnegie Hall, wearing an elegant black gown that Alexander had arranged for her. Her children were in the audience, along with her 2 grandchildren. Sophia had cried when Maria told her about the performance, saying she had never known her mother had once been a concert pianist. "You never told us," Sophia had said, hurt evident in her voice. "I didn't want you to feel like I had given up my dreams for you," Maria had explained. "I didn't want you to carry that guilt. Every choice I made with love. I would do it all again." Now, standing in the wings of one of the most famous concert halls in the world, Maria felt her hands shaking. The audience was filing in, thousands of people taking their seats. She could hear the murmur of conversation, the rustle of programs. These people had paid good money to see Alexander Chen, the famous virtuoso. What would they think when they saw a cleaning lady walk out onto that stage? Alexander appeared beside her, looking calm and confident in his tuxedo. "How are you feeling?" he asked. "Terrified," Maria admitted. "I think I might be sick." "Good," Alexander said, and when she looked at him in surprise, he smiled. "If you weren't scared, it would mean this didn't matter to you. Fear means you care. Fear means you're about to do something real." The stage manager signaled that it was time. Alexander walked out first, and Maria heard the applause that greeted him. It was thunderous, the kind of reception that a celebrity receives. She waited, in the wings, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might break through her chest. Then she heard Alexander's voice through the speakers. "Good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming tonight. Before we begin, I need to tell you a story." Maria listened as Alexander recounted their meeting, how a woman he had dismissed as just a cleaning lady had taught him the most important lesson of his life. He spoke about her sacrifice, her hidden talent, her years of silence. His voice was emotional in a way the audience had clearly never heard from him before. "Tonight," Alexander said, "you're not just here to listen to me. You're here to witness the return of someone who should never have disappeared from music in the first place. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Maria Elena Rodriguez Vasquez. The applause started before Maria even stepped onto the stage. When she walked out into the lights, she saw the entire audience on their feet. Tears blurred her vision as she made her way to the piano where Alexander stood waiting. He took her hand and squeezed it gently. "You've got this," he whispered. They sat down together at the piano side by side. They were going to perform Schubert's Fantasia in F minor for 4 hands, a piece that required perfect synchronization and deep musical understanding between the two performers. It was ambitious, perhaps too ambitious, but Alexander had insisted. "This piece is about 2 voices becoming one," he had told her during their practice. "It's about partnership, about trust. It's perfect for us." Maria took a deep breath and looked out at the audience. Somewhere in that sea of faces were her children, watching their mother do something they had never imagined she could do. Somewhere up in heaven, Roberto was watching too, she liked to think, proud of her for finally reclaiming this part of herself. She placed her hands on the keys. Beside her, Alexander did the same. Their eyes met, and in that moment all the fear melted away. This was where she belonged. This was who she was. They began to play. The music that filled Carnegie Hall that night was unlike anything Alexander had ever produced in his celebrated career. The technical brilliance was there as always, but now it was infused with something deeper. Maria's part wove through his like a conversation between old friends, sometimes leading, sometimes following, but always connected. Her playing had all the emotion and honesty she had shown that first day in his apartment. But now it was refined, focused, channeled into something transcendent. The audience sat in absolute silence, mesmerized. Some people cried. Some closed their eyes and let the music wash over them. Some sat forward in their seats, unable to believe what they were hearing. This wasn't just a performance. It was a resurrection. When the final notes faded away, the silence lasted for several long seconds. Then the audience exploded. The standing ovation went on for 12 minutes. People were shouting, crying, stamping their feet. Critics who had seen thousands of performances looked stunned. Alexander's agent, standing at the back of the hall, was already on his phone, fielding calls from people who wanted to book Maria for future concerts, but Maria barely noticed any of it. She was looking at her children in the 3rd row, watching them applaud with tears streaming down their faces. Sophia was holding her grandmother's old photograph, the one of Maria at her Juilliard graduation. Miguel had his arm around his sister, and little Elena was standing on her seat, clapping as hard as she could. Alexander stood and took Maria's hand, raising it high as the applause continued. "Thank you," he mouthed to her over the noise, but Maria shook her head and squeezed his hand back. "No," she said. "Thank you." In the days that followed, Maria's story spread across the internet and news outlets. The video of her performance went viral. Offers came pouring in for interviews, performances, recording contracts. A prestigious music academy offered her a position teaching master classes. A documentary filmmaker wanted to tell her story. But more importantly, letters started arriving from people all over the world. From parents who had given up their dreams for their children. From workers in ordinary jobs who had buried their talents under the weight of responsibility. From young people in poor neighborhoods who had been told that classical music wasn't for people like them. "You showed us that it's never too late," one letter read. "You showed us that sacrifice doesn't mean surrender." Alexander's life changed too. His playing became deeper, more emotionally resonant. Critics noticed the difference immediately. But more than that, he became a different person. The arrogance that had defined him for so long was gone, replaced by humility and gratitude. He started a scholarship fund for talented music students from low-income families, naming it after Maria's first teacher, Mrs. Chenna, one morning. 6 months after that life-changing Carnegie Hall performance, Maria arrived at Alexander's apartment for their weekly practice session. They had continued to perform together, and their partnership had become one of the most talked-about collaborations in classical music. "I have something to tell you," Maria said as they sat down at the piano. Alexander looked at her with concern. "What is it?" "I've been offered a position. Artist in residence at Juilliard. They want me to teach and perform. It's everything I once dreamed of all those years ago." "Maria, that's incredible," Alexander said, genuinely thrilled. "You have to accept." "I already did," Maria said with a smile. but I wanted to thank you first. You gave me back my life. You saw me when I was invisible." Alexander shook his head. "You were never invisible. I was just blind. You taught me how to see, how to really hear music again, how to be human. I should be thanking you." They sat together at the piano, two musicians who had found each other in the most unlikely way. One had everything and learned humility. The other had nothing and found hope. Together they had discovered what music was really meant to be. Not a performance, not a competition, not a path to fame or fortune, just honesty, courage, and the belief that it's never too late to reclaim your dreams.